historical and economic research, and my U.S. and global perspective give me a unique sense of its past and present. After you read this, you can decide for yourself whether or not that's true. China's culture, by which I mean its people's innate expectations about how families and communities should behave with each other and how leaders should lead and followers should follow, evolved over thousands of years through the rises and falls of its many ruling dynasties and the development of Confucian and Neo-Confucian philosophy as well as other beliefs. I have seen these typical Chinese values and ways of operating manifested over and over again. For example, in the economic and leadership approaches of two men, Lee Kuan Yew, the former longtime Prime Minister of Singapore, and Deng Xiaoping, who initiated China's reform and opening up. Both combined Confucian values with capitalist practices, in Deng's case creating a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics. Over the last couple of years, as part of my study of the rises and declines of empires and their currencies, I have also undertaken a study of Chinese history to help me understand how the Chinese think, especially their leaders, who are greatly influenced by history. I began my research with the year 600, just before the Tang dynasty. While I can be pretty certain about my impressions of the people and things that I have had direct contact with, I of course can't be as certain about those I haven't. My thoughts about historical figures such as Mao Zedong are based on facts gathered, experts' thinking gathered from conversations and books, and conjecture. What I can say is that between my own experience, the efforts of my research team, and my extensive triangulation with some of the most knowledgeable China scholars and practitioners on the planet, I have a high degree of confidence in my conclusions. Since my RST trip to China in 1984, I have come to know many Chinese, from the lowest to the highest in rank, in an up-close, personal way, and I have experienced their recent history as directly as I have experienced America's. As a result, I believe that I understand both the American and Chinese perspectives pretty well. I urge those of you who haven't spent considerable time in China to look past the caricatured pictures that are often painted by biased parties and rid yourself of any stereotypes you might have that are based on what you thought you knew about the old, communist China, because they're wrong. Triangulate whatever you are hearing or reading with people who have spent a lot of time in China working with the Chinese people. As an aside, I think the widespread media distortions and the blind and near-violent loyalties that stand in the way of the thoughtful exploration of our different perspectives are a frightening sign of our times. To be clear, I'm not ideological. I don't choose a side on an issue based on whether it aligns with American, Chinese, or my own personal beliefs. I'm practical. I approach things like a doctor who relies on logic and cause-effect relationships and believes in what works well through time. The only thing I can do is beg for your patience and open-mindedness as I share what I've learned with you. I laid out the factors that I believe are most important to a country's health when I discussed the 18 determinants at the beginning of this book. Of those, I highlighted 8 measures of power: education, competitiveness, innovation, technology, trade, economic output, military, financial center status, and reserve currency status. When I judge China's strengths and weaknesses, it is through the lens of those factors. I also try to understand China's circumstances as the Chinese themselves do, through their eyes. To refresh your memory, this chart shows the relative standing of the world's leading countries as measured in indices that measure 8 different types of power. In examining the rises and declines of the great empires since 1500, I looked at each of these measures. I will now do the same for China, briefly conveying the long arc of its history while diving into its highlights in a more granular way. Breaking this rise down further, the following chart shows the 8 measures of power for China between 1800 and the present. Unlike the cycles for the Dutch, British, and American empires, which began with their rises and were followed by their protracted declines, China's cycle over the past 200 years was a long decline followed by a rapid rise. Though the order is reversed, the same forces drove the cycle. 7 of the 8 powers hit their lowest points in the 1940-50 period. Since then, most of them, notably economic competitiveness, education, and military power, improved gradually until around 1980, when China's economic competitiveness and trade took off. That was right after Deng Xiaoping's open door and reform policies began. That is no coincidence. From my RST visit to China in 1984 until about 2008, debt growth was in line with economic growth, which was very strong. In other words, extremely rapid improvements were made without loading the economy up with debt. Then the 2008 financial crisis came along and China, like the rest of the world, used a lot of debt to stimulate its economy, so debts rose relative to incomes. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, he improved China's debt and economic management dramatically, continued growth in innovation and technologies, strengthened education and the military, and encountered greater ICT with the US. China is now roughly tied with the US in being the leading power in trade, economic output, and innovation and technology, and it is a strong and quickly rising military and educational power. It is an emerging power in the financial sector but is lagging as a reserve currency and financial center. We will explore all of this in more detail later in the chapter, but in order to understand China's present we need to wade into its tremendous history. China's giant history in a tiny nutshell. Anyone who wants to have a fundamental understanding of China needs to know the basics of its history, the many patterns that repeat within it, and the timeless and universal principles that its leaders have gained from studying those patterns. Getting even a basic understanding of Chinese history is a considerable undertaking. Spanning some 4,000 years, it is so vast and complicated, and has inspired so many different and sometimes contradictory interpretations, that I am content that there is no single source of truth, and I am especially content that I'm not it. Still, there is a lot that knowledgeable people agree on, and many scholars and practitioners, both Chinese and non-Chinese, have shared valuable insights with me. Trying to piece together all that I have learned has not only been a valuable experience for me but also a fascinating one. While I can't guarantee that my perspectives are the best, I can guarantee that they have been well triangulated with some of the most informed people in the world. China's civilization began around 2000 BC with the Xia dynasty, which lasted about 400 years and is credited with bringing the Bronze Age to Asia. Confucius, who developed the philosophy that most influences how the Chinese behave with each other to this day, lived from 551 to 479 BC. The Qin dynasty united most of the geographic area that we now call China around 221 BC and was followed by the 400-year Han dynasty, which pioneered governance systems that are still in use. The Tang dynasty came to the fore in 618 CE. This chart applies to China the same overall power gauge that I showed you in the chart of great empires, covering the more than 1,400 years between 600 and today, with the notable exception of the period from around 1840 to 1950, when it experienced a steep decline. China has historically stood among the most powerful empires in the world. As it emerged from civil war, it began to rise again, at slowly and then very rapidly. Today it is second only to the US and is poised to surpass it. Most of the dynasties that ruled China over the course of this time span were as cultured as they were powerful. Each of these dynasties has its own fascinating story, but to do those stories justice would take far more space than can't in this chapter. The Tang dynasty is considered by many Chinese to be a high point of imperial China. The Tang came to power after a prolonged period of disunion and civil war, which had culminated in China being reunited by the short-lived Sui dynasty, which immediately preceded the Tang. The dynasty was established by a father-son pair of strong leaders, with the son, the Tang's second emperor Taizong, being especially notable. They not only militarily united China, but also established a stable government system and policies that were highly effective, producing quality education, excellent development of technologies, international trade, and diverse ideas. Taizong was a great revolutionary leader who was able to consolidate power, build a great dynasty, and transition well so that the dynasty remained strong without him. A period of great prosperity lasted about 150 years, with a particularly strong military that helped the Tang control valuable trade routes in Central Asia. By the late 700s, however, the Tang slipped into decline for the classic reasons. The quality of governance fell, fragmentation over economic and values gaps led to a weakened and corrupt central government, its finances deteriorated, and natural disasters increased in impact. Then came the northern and southern Song dynasties, during which China was the most innovative and dynamic economy in the world. The deterioration of the Tang dynasty led to its own period of civil war and disunion in the 900s. Out of this Khan ICT, the Song dynasty came to power under the rule of Emperor Taizu in 960. Taizu was one of those classic strong revolutionary leaders who needed to and could bring order to chaos. He successfully rose to power as a military leader and, when in power, implemented widespread reforms to A. Bring together the D-errant factions that had previously fought for power, B. Create a centralized, top-down system of military and civilian governance, and C. Expand education and the quality of governance. These investments in education and meritocracy under Taizu and his successors set the Song dynasty on the classic good path that led to immense scientific and technological advancement. However, after a few generations, around the year 1100, the dynasty declined due to a combination of weak leadership, financial problems, and other classic factors. In its weakened state, it became vulnerable to external powers. During the 1100s and 1200s, the Song lost control of the northern half of China, then, after a revival period known as the Southern Song dynasty, were conquered by Mongol leader Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan founded the comparatively short-lived Yuan dynasty. For much of his rule, Kublai Khan governed well and behaved like a classic dynastic founder. He encouraged education, uni-ed the state, and relative to many other Mongol leaders, stood out for his meritocratic and open-minded style of governing. Under Kublai Khan, China's economy and trade strengthened after a long period of Khan ICT. At the same time, the Yuan pursued expensive wars of conquest. Corruption grew later in his rule, and the failure to establish a stable succession structure led to frequent civil wars and crises after his death. This corruption and instability helped produce rebellions that ended the dynasty after less than a century. The Ming dynasty presided over an empire that was largely prosperous and peaceful. It was founded by the Han Wu emperor, who was born into poverty and rose to be a great general who captured Beijing and threw out the Mongol rulers. He consolidated power in a 14-year purge that led to about 30,000 executions. After winning power through a successful rebellion against the unpopular Yuan dynasty, early Ming leaders built a meritocratic society with excellent education and civil behavior that fostered innovation. Over time, the Ming dynasty expanded trade with Europe, which brought in enormous amounts of silver and redirected the nation's energies from subsistence agriculture to industry. However, the Ming's failure to manage monetary and fiscal policy well, to consistently support China's influence over international trade, and to adequately respond to a series of crises left China exposed and vulnerable. To make matters worse, the Little Ice Age led to agricultural disaster and famine. In the end, war, famine, and ecological disaster, combined with a rigid and ineffectual state, created an unrecoverable catastrophe that led to the collapse of the nearly 3-centuries-old Ming dynasty by 1644. The Qing dynasty came to power when the neighboring Manchu people capitalized on instability and rebellions in Ming China to challenge it. This culminated in the sacking of Beijing by rebels, during which the last Ming emperor committed suicide. Then the cycle began again under the Qing dynasty. China achieved its maximum territorial expansion, governing over a third of the world's population, while reforms under the reigns of 3 long-ruling emperors led to an extended period of economic prosperity. Then the European powers arrived. Earlier in this book we saw how the European powers, in the age of exploration, used their military strength to trade with and exploit resource-rich but militarily weaker foreigners. That's what happened starting in the early 1800s, which began what is called the Century of Humiliation in China. The Europeans came owing to trade, but the Chinese didn't want anything they had to owe. This led to the British bringing opium into China to get the Chinese addicted, so that they would trade for it. A series of military confrontations followed during the 1800s, which sped China's decline. Chinese moves to stem their decline failed, and there was great internal Khan ICT and uprisings, which continued until the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912. The lessons this history provides remain very much in the forefront of the minds of China's current leaders and are fascinating to me, especially in the context of the patterns of history. How the typical dynastic cycle transpires. The typical major Chinese dynasty, like the typical empire, lasted about 250 years, give or take 150 years, and by and large followed the same pattern of rises and declines. You can especially see the internal order cycle, described in Chapter 5, at play time and time again. As a reminder of that cycle. Stage 1. When the new order begins and the new leadership consolidates power, which leads to. Stage 2. When the resource allocation systems and government bureaucracies are built and renewed, which if done well leads to. Stage 3. When there is peace and prosperity, which leads to. Stage 4. When there are great excesses in spending and debt and the widening of wealth and political gaps, which leads to. Stage 5. When there are very bad financial conditions and intense ICT, which leads to. Stage 6. When there are civil wars, revolutions, which leads to. Stage 1, which leads to Stage 2, etc., with the whole cycle happening over again. Let's review this cycle quickly. The typical cycle begins with strong leaders who win control and implement improvements needed to build a great empire. As with most other empires, the initial winning of the war for control is typically followed by struggling to get most of the population in line and united. That is typically followed by a peace that is due to no entities wanting to challenge the dominant power. Then the new ruler turns to building up the empire. To be successful, an empire needs a smart and determined population that works well with each other. It also needs to be strong Nancy ally. These things are obtained by systems that train and produce people who have strong education and self-discipline. Getting the most capable people into the most important roles requires the meritocratic selection of people. In Chinese dynasties, the imperial exams often played that role, and it was common for new dynasties to implement educational reforms. It also requires an active resource allocation system. During that period of peace and rising power, the empire typically works well economically and improves its financial condition. While the empire typically starts with limited financial resources and low debts because the previous empire's debts have been wiped out, in some cases it has assets that were acquired as an outcome of the prior war that it won. In the case of Chinese history, key variables were the distribution of land ownership and taxation of it. Often the arrival of a new dynasty weakened or overturned the corrupt elites of the prior system, vastly improving the resources available to the state. With these resources, the dynasty protests and expands. It builds commercial, technological, and military strengths that reinforce each other. For example, having strong technologies helps the dynasty economically and militarily because they can be used for both purposes and because being strong militarily protects the country's commercial interests, which also strengthens the dynasty Nancy ally. At its peak, the dynasty's government is functioning well, its resources and people are employed productively, and prior investments are yielding new gains. The economy is strong and self-sustaining, and the people are prosperous and produce great achievements in scholarship, the arts, trade, architecture, and other elements of great civilizations. The decline of the empire typically happens because the forces that strengthened it fade and a rival power emerges. Leadership weakens, often becomes corrupt, and or allows corruption in others. Also, the dynasty typically becomes overextended and quite often becomes heavily indebted, which causes it to have debt problems that are typically dealt with by printing lots of money, which in turn devalues the money. The dynasty's population also becomes increasingly fragmented and loses its unity of purpose and ability to work well together. The wealth gap increases, which undermines productivity and leads to political ICT. Often there is some form of natural disaster, frequently a drought or a that exacerbates the dynasty's problems. The more of these that happen at the same time, the greater the chance that the dynasty will fall. The fall itself comes with escalating rebellions and then a bloody civil war. Eventually a strong new leader emerges, wins the ICT, and begins the cycle again with a new dynasty. There are common themes in the decline of the different dynasties, themes also visible in the decline of some of the other powers mentioned in this book. 1. Growing inequality and scale problems over the course of the dynasty are critical drivers of the decline. Dynasties often started with more equal land and wealth holdings. As the concentrated holdings of the old dynasty's elites were redistributed, which helped with preventing social con-ICT and helped the scalp position. But over the years, land became concentrated in fewer and fewer families, who could evade taxes, which in turn allowed them to build their wealth further. The inequality this produced helped directly spawn con-ICT, and the weakening tax base of the state made the state weaker and more vulnerable to crisis. 2. Monetary problems were common contributors to the decline of the empires. In the Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties, the government struggled to maintain a large enough money supply in metal coins and resorted to money printing, especially in times of war and natural or human-caused disaster. The problems with collecting taxes made the incentive to print even stronger. This caused high-inflation or hyperinflation, making matters worse. 3. The quality of governance and infrastructure tended to rise early in each dynasty, and then fall over the course of the dynasty. Later in the Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties, years of underinvestment in public works built up, leaving China vulnerable to famines and floods. And while it's hard to generalize over dozens of emperors, the visionary founder of the dynasty was typically succeeded by rulers who were more rigid and conservative, too focused on imperial riches and luxuries, e.g., the last rulers of the northern Song dynasty, and or less supportive of foreign trade. 4. Internal con-ICT usually arose from economic deerrances combined with bad times. Significant natural disasters and periods of quick climate change that were painfully disruptive often coincided with the fall of dynasties. The classic downward spiral has been that one, inadequate technology and investment leaves infrastructure susceptible to natural disasters. 2. A disaster hits, which damages crop yields and, in some cases, destroys communities, as lower crop yields lead to food scarcity and famine. And 3. Domestic populist uprisings result from the disasters. This process played a significant role in the declines of the Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. 5. Bad conditions and large wealth gaps led to the most significant uprisings, which were due to the common man rebelling against the excesses of the elite. Conversely, domestic stability arising from good conditions for most people was a key characteristic of the more prosperous periods. 6. Isolation and Confucian cultural nuances that favored scholarship over commerce, technology, and military strength led to China's weaker competitiveness in business, technology, and the military, which led it to be beaten by or fall behind stronger barbarians, e.g., the Mongols, the foreign powers in the Opium Wars, and the rest of the world in the Mao isolation period. China's physical geography and geology have also had a big impact on the rise and fall of dynasties. The main thing to know is that China's terrain is varied and often volatile. For example, the north is colder, hotter, and drier, and the south is more mountainous, much warmer, and wetter, which leads to China's arid areas having often inconsistent crop production. However, a united China is largely self-contained because the diversification and coordination of the parts make it that way. Still, these conditions plus shortages of clean water, cropland, and coastal marine fisheries have historically made China vulnerable to food shortages. For that reason, China has often been food insecure and even today imports a lot of food. China also has shortages of important natural resources, such as oil, some minerals, and some foods too. It also has bad air pollution that adversely affects the health of its people and its agriculture, though it is quickly improving these conditions. Such events led past and current leaders of China to learn lessons and establish protections against these natural and political disasters being repeated or leading to unacceptable consequences. In other words, there are many lessons embedded in these histories, and believe me, all of them influence the decision-making of China's leaders today, whether they are planning for the long term or dealing with cases at hand. What is especially interesting to me is seeing how far back in history the patterns of the archetypical big cycle go, since China's history is both so ancient and so well documented. I was also fascinated to see what happened when the Eastern and Western worlds interacted more significantly from the 17th through the 19th centuries, and how, as the world became much smaller and more interconnected, the Chinese and Western big cycles affected each other. Probably the most important thing I gained from studying the history of so many countries is the ability to see the big patterns of causes and effects. Shifting my perspective to the very long term felt like zooming out in Google Maps because it allowed me to see contours that I couldn't see before, and how the same stories play out over and over again for basically the same reasons. I also came to understand how having so much history to study has affected the Chinese way of thinking, which is very different from the American way of thinking, which is much more focused on what is happening now. Most Americans believe their own history is just 300 or 400 years old, and they aren't terribly interested in learning from it. Whether they are interested or not, 300 years seems like a very long time ago to Americans, but for the Chinese, it isn't long at all. While the prospect of a revolution or a war that will overturn the US system is unimaginable to most Americans, both seem inevitable to the Chinese because they have seen those things happen again and again and have studied the patterns that inevitably precede them. While most Americans focus on particular events, especially those that are happening now, most Chinese leaders view current events in the context of larger, more evolutionary patterns. Americans are impulsive and tactical. They GHT for what they want in the present. Most Chinese are strategic. They plan for how they can get what they want in the future. I have also found Chinese leaders to be much more philosophical than American leaders. For example, I had a meeting with a Chinese leader who had just met President Donald Trump and had concerns about the possibility of a US-China CONICT. He explained how he approached the meeting, which struck me as starkly different from how President Trump likely had. This leader and I have known each other for many years, during which time we have talked mostly about the Chinese and world economies and markets. Over those years we have developed a friendship. He is a very skilled, wise, humble, and likable man, he explained. That going into his meeting with Trump, he was concerned about the worst-case scenario where tit-for-tat escalations could get out of control and lead to war. He referred to history and gave a personal story of his father to convey his perspective that wars were so unimaginably harmful, and the damage of the next war could be worse than the last war, which had killed more people than any other. He focused on World War I as an example. He said that to calm himself down and gain equanimity he read Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant, and he realized that he could only do his best and then the outcomes would take their course. I told him about the Serenity Prayer and suggested meditation to him. I went home and read Critique of Pure Reason again, which I found challenging. I did, and still do, admire him and value his perspective greatly. I tell this story to share with you one Chinese leader's perspective on the risk of wars and to also give one example of the many interactions I've had with this leader and of the many interactions I've had with many Chinese leaders and Chinese people in order to help you see them through my eyes. And through their eyes. Chinese historian philosophy, most importantly Confucian Taoist legalist Marxist philosophies, have a much bigger influence on Chinese thinking than American history and its Judeo-Christian European philosophical roots have on American thinking. An esteemed Chinese historian told me that Mao read the mammoth 20-volume Chronicle Comprehensive Mirror for Aid in Government, which covers the 16 dynasties and 1,400 years of Chinese history from around 400 BC to 960 CE, and the even more mammoth 24 histories several times, as well as numerous volumes about Chinese history and the writings of non-Chinese philosophers, most importantly Marx. He also wrote and spoke philosophically, wrote poetry, and practiced calligraphy. If you are interested in what Mao thought or, more importantly, how he thought, I suggest you read On Practice, On Contradiction, and of course the Little Red Book, which is a compendium of his quotations on a number of subjects. The planning horizon that Chinese leaders concern themselves with is well over a century because that's at least how long a good dynasty lasts. They understand that the typical arc of development has different multi-decade phases in it, which they plan for. The RST phase of the current Chinese empire occurred under Mao when the revolution took place, control of the country was won, and power and institutions were solid. The second phase of building wealth, power, and cohesiveness without threatening the leading world power occurred under Deng and his successors up to Xi. The third phase of building on these accomplishments and moving China toward where it has set out to be on the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China in 2049, which is to be a modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious. is occurring under Xi and his successors. Its ultimate goal is to make the Chinese economy about twice the size of the US's and to have the benefits of its growth broadly shared. Nearer-term goals and ways to achieve them were set out in the Made in China 2025 plan, Xi's New China Standards Plan 2035, and the usual Veiller plans. Chinese leaders don't just try to implement their plans. They set out clear metrics by which to judge their performance, and they achieve most of their goals. I'm not saying that this process is perfect because it isn't, and I'm not saying that they don't have political and other challenges that lead to disagreements, including some brutal GHTS over what should be done, because they do. What I am saying is that the Chinese have much longer-term and historically based perspectives and planning horizons, which they break down into shorter-term plans and ways of operating, and they have done an excellent job of achieving what they have set out to do by following this approach. Coincidentally, my own search for patterns in history and my way of dealing with tactical decisions has had a similar EECT on how I see and do things, e.g. I now view the last 500 years as recent history. The most relevant historical arcs seem about 100+ years long, and the patterns I've gleaned from this perspective help me anticipate how events are likely to transpire, and how I should be positioned for them over the coming weeks, months, and years. China's lessons and its ways of operating. Chinese culture developed as an extension of the experiences the Chinese had and the lessons they learned from them over the course of millennia. These were set out in philosophies about how things work and what ways work best in dealing with those realities, which made clear how people should be with each other, how political decision-making should be done, and how economic systems should work. In the Western world, the dominant philosophies are Judeo-Christian, democratic, and capitalist socialist, and each individual pretty much chooses from them to come up with a mix that suits them. In China, the main philosophies were Confucian, Taoist, and legalist until the early 20th century, when Marxism and capitalism entered the mix. Emperors typically choose their own preferences, put them into practice, learn, and adapt. If the mix works, the dynasty survives and prospers. If it doesn't, it fails and is replaced by another. This process has gone on from before history was recorded, and will go on for as long as there are people who have to decide how to do things collectively. While I can't do these philosophies justice in a couple of sentences, here are my attempts. Confucianism seeks to bring about harmony by ensuring that people know their roles in the hierarchy, and how to play them well, starting from within the family and extending up to the ruler and their subjects. Each person respects and obeys those above them, who are benevolent, and at the same time impose strict standards of behavior. All people are expected to be kind, honest, and fair. Confucianism values harmony, broad-based education, and meritocracy. Legalism favors the rapid conquest and unification of everything under heaven by an autocratic leader. It argues that the world is a killer-be-killed jungle in which strict obedience to the emperor is central. Government is required, without much benevolence given in return. The Western equivalent of legalism is fascism. Taoism teaches that it is of paramount importance to live in harmony with the laws of nature. Taoists believe that nature is composed of opposites, yin and yang, and that harmony is achieved when they are balanced well. Until the early 20th century, when Marxism gained favor with Mao and his successors, Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism were the most influential philosophies, usually with some legalism thrown in. I will briefly explain Marxism when we get into the 20th century. All of these Chinese systems are hierarchical and non-egalitarian. Wang Qishan, the vice president of China and a remarkable historian and explorer of different cultures, told me that the core difference between Americans and the Chinese is that Americans hold the individual above all else while the Chinese put the family and the collective above everything. America is run from the bottom up and optimized for the individual. China is run from the top down and optimized for the collective. The Chinese word country consists of the two characters for state and family, he explained, so Chinese leaders seek to run their state the way they think parents should run their families, with each person knowing their place and having loyal respect for those above them. As a result, the Chinese are more humble, respectful, and rules-bound, while Americans are more arrogant, egalitarian, and rules-averse. I've observed that while the Chinese are more interested in asking questions and learning, Americans are more interested in telling you what they think. As for governance structure, the Chinese have evolved well-developed approaches over many dynasties and thousands of years. To go into them in depth would require too great a digression. Unlike other great empires that have conquered and occupied other countries, it was relatively uncommon for China to occupy distant states. China is basically a giant plain surrounded by big natural borders, mountains, and seas, with the bulk of its population spread across the plain. Most of China's world was continented within those borders, and most of its wars were fought for control of it, mostly among the Chinese, though sometimes between foreign invaders and the Chinese. Traditional Chinese military philosophy teaches that the ideal way to win a war is not by guiding but by quietly developing one's power to the point that simply displaying it will cause an opponent to capitulate. It also calls for the extensive use of psychology to influence opponents' behaviors. Still, there have been numerous violent dynastic wars inside China. The few wars that were fought outside China were for the purpose of establishing China's relative power and opening trade. Scholars believe that China was loath to expand its empire because its land mass was already so large and difficult to control, and because they have preferred to maintain a cultural purity that is best achieved through isolation. Traditionally, the Chinese have preferred to enter into relations with empires outside their borders in a manner that is similar to what one might expect from the previously mentioned philosophies, i.e., with the parties knowing their places and acting accordingly. If China was more powerful, which was typically the case, the less powerful states paid tribute, with gifts and favors, and typically received guarantees of peace, recognition of their authorities, and trading opportunities in return. These subordinate countries typically maintained their customs and experienced no interference in how their countries were run. China's monetary and economic history. As for money, credit, and the economy, the history is very long and complicated. That said, China has gone through the full range of money credit economic systems and cycles that I described earlier when discussing the big cycle of money and credit. The currency the Chinese used the most was metal, which continued long after China invented paper money in the 9th century, until the introduction of the yuan in the late 19th century. Silver was the main currency used internationally, though gold was also sometimes used. Understanding the de-rent systems is especially important for China, as they shifted frequently between them, and it helped produce prosperity or ruin in de-rent periods, depending on how the system was managed. China experienced several cycles of 1. Transitioning from hard currency to paper backed by hard currency, then 2. Seeing trust in the currency increase until the paper currency was circulated with no backing. Then 3. Having the paper currency collapse due to overprinting and loss of faith, leading to the return to a hard currency. As I explained in Chapter 3, there are 3 basic types of monetary systems. In the RST, which I call a Type 1 monetary system, money has intrinsic value. In the second, which I call a Type 2 monetary system, money is linked to assets that have intrinsic value. In a Type 3 monetary system, money is not linked to anything objective. The following diagram conveys an ultra-simplified picture of how these currency systems rotated throughout China's history since the Tang dynasty. In fact, de-rent parts of China had de-rent currencies and at times used coins and ingots from other countries. Still, the diagram is broadly indicative and meant to show that China had the same range of monetary systems as the rest of the world, and they worked in essentially the same ways, most importantly, with cycles in which hard money was abandoned due to debt problems, leading to inflation, hyperinflation, and finally a return to hard money. At the start of the Tang dynasty, money primarily consisted of copper coins. But as is classic, the supply of hard currency proved to be constraining. China was growing quickly, and the supply of copper wasn't keeping up to provide enough money. Additionally, each copper coin was of low value, and so to trade, merchants had to physically carry perhaps hundreds of thousands of copper coins, which was impractical. These pressures led to the invention of the earliest forms of non-hard, money-like instruments. Flying cash started out as essentially drafts from a bank, but merchants would circulate them like money. Eventually, the Tang government started to supervise their issuance and use. That said, day-to-day monetary transactions continued to be mainly in copper coinage. True paper money came a bit later in Chinese history. In the early 1100s during the Song dynasty, the government took over the money-making industry and created the RST commodity-backed paper money. The paper money soon was accepted, and what it was backed by took on a subordinate importance. Thus began an early version of a monetary system. However, similar to bonds, the paper money had a maturity date, after which it was retired. The Song dynasty not only invented money, they also were the RST to overprint and devalue paper money. By the mid-1100s, the financial demands on the Song treasury were extremely high, due to foreign wars and domestic revolts. As is quite typical of the declines of empires, rather than increasing taxes or cutting spending, which they didn't want to do because it would have increased discontent, they printed currency to fund their deficits. Initially, the monetization of deficits was manageable. The RST currency, known as Huizi notes, was issued in modest quantities starting in 1160 and traded at near face value for more than 30 years. But the Song government soon printed more freely, more than tripling the amount of Huizi in circulation. As internal and external conflicts continued to strain the imperial treasury, the money supply nearly tripled again between 1209 and 1231. As a result, the market value of that paper money fell by over 90% between 1195 and the 1230s. The same patterns repeated several more times. The Yuan dynasty, feeling constrained by metal currency, created a new paper currency, but then overprinted it, causing the currency to eventually collapse. The early Ming dynasty, also feeling constrained by metal currency, created paper money to provide funds to establish a new state, but then overprinted it, eventually causing the currency to collapse. These are fascinating stories I won't delve into now. Following the failure of money at the start of the Ming dynasty, China gave up experimentation with paper currencies until the 20th century. Instead, from the mid-14th century to around 1933, China had different types of metal coins, primarily silver. The intrinsic value of that silver constituted the significant majority of their value, though there was some premium placed on the coins themselves. For a major portion of that time, largely up until 1933, China didn't mint, and the coins came RST from Spain, then Mexico, then North America. In 1933, the Chinese chose to create their own national coinage, which began to circulate. 2 years later, the Chinese government decided to replace the yuan with the fabi, in order to move from a currency they couldn't print to one they could. The fabi in turn experienced increasingly rampant hyperinflation due to overprinting by the Republic of China government in World War II and the initial phases of the Chinese Civil War that followed. Following the foundation of the People's Republic of China, the renminbi was introduced and remains in use to this day. As for China's broader economy,